Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today, our guest is Sergy Mummert. He's the Senior Vice President for Sales Global Cloud and Strategic Partnerships at SES. The subject of network resilience has unfortunately been in the limelight over the last few years, whether in the context of the war in Ukraine or cyber attacks on communications networks or increasingly severe weather incidents. When access to connectivity is lost or limited, there can be huge humanitarian and socioeconomic implications, particularly given how so many of us have been reliant on digital services in our everyday lives. For example, nearly three-quarters of North Carolina's cell sites were knocked out by the Hurricane Helene in September 2024, with those communications disruptions delaying rescue efforts, particularly in the western part of the state. A 2023 cyber attack on Ukrainian mobile operator Kyivstar left millions of Ukrainians without access to communications or the internet and affected air raid alerts in the Kyiv region that notified residents of Russian missile strikes. Not only that, but AT&T. Network outage back in February of 2024 cost the company millions and affected public safety communications, including AT&T subscribers' ability to reach emergency services. Next-generation satellite technology has the potential to mitigate that impact by creating a resilient network fabric. With us today, again, Sergy Mummert, Senior Vice President, Sales Global Cloud and Strategic Partnerships at SES, who's been working with partners and end users to expand the concept of satellite-enabled resilience to encompass more than just the network. More than the network, really? So, Sergy, what role has the satellite industry historically played in network resilience?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, satellite communications has often been used, obviously, for media distribution, cable head and satellite TV. It's also been used for remote data networks, but principally as a primary network, right? I think that's most of our experience. But in many segments today, they're using multi-network deployments. And so that's where we're moving. But in terms of using it to supplement terrestrial networks, a long time ago that wasn't that common because it was sort of saying, I got my primary network, I'm happy. But I think based on these events you kind of described in the experience of either both natural or unnatural events disrupting networks, the idea of a multi-network deployment, terrestrial and satellite, multiple satellite orbits being involved to give even more resiliency for something that moves or something that's very remote, we are starting to see a progression to using satellite communications in a network design.
Yeah, this multi is a trending phrase. I was at an event yesterday, talked about multi-cloud, multi-modal, multi-orbit, all kinds of multis going on. It's nice to have that because it does give flexibility if, it's constructed properly. Right. So, Sergy, how do you define network resilience? How does that differ from infrastructure resilience?
Well, I deal mostly with hyperscalers. So if they look at their infrastructure, it's a mixture of their compute, their storage, and the network. So the network's a component of the infrastructure, the way to look at it. But many times you're looking at not just the network, you're looking at the services and the applications that are running across it to make sure you prioritize and designed your network to deal with the key things you want to maintain. You might have, lower value services, emails, whatever it might be, that don't need as much resiliency, and you may have control plane requirements that need really high availability to maintain the operations. So you may actually differentiate in your system what you want a different resiliency, and so that's part of the thinking.
As individuals, enterprises, and governments rely more and more on digital services, so how can satellite ensure that access to those services withstands any impact to the terrestrial network?
So there's several things to think about. One is for the satellite industry, we've been trying to make sure we start working with partners and developers that are in the early stage of that process. Oftentimes, if a network goes down, they say, well, what are we going to do? Well, let's find someone who has a satellite connection, and that's sort of a reactive approach. The goal really lately has been thinking about the process that someone goes through in the network planning and making sure that satellite communication is part of their toolkit. Making sure that we're in areas that we probably haven't been seen before, working with system integrators and maybe vertically integrated players to sort of say, how do you integrate the SATCOM service? So some examples would be when they're developing an endpoint, they say, well, gee, This endpoint in the past has had a connection, but we've designed it to be disconnected at times because we just don't think we'll have resilient connections. We said, well, no, that doesn't have to be the case. You can actually put multiple network connections, maybe different types of satellite systems, and have a more resilient architecture. The other thing that we're seeing, just to kind of set the stage, is a lot of enterprises and the hyperscalers we're working with have done kind of operations infrastructure threat and risk assessments. And they've isolated where they see the higher risk and threats. Maybe it might be a natural risk or an unnatural threat. And then they say, well, gee, what do we do to actually improve that area, that application in terms of its resiliency? So it could be actually, like I said, upfront, understanding the objective and then designing it in.
You know, when I think of an enterprise architect, I've met many of them. I think of a data center and a whiteboard and people arguing. And I never say, look up. Maybe your job is to, hey, look up, man. This is part of the enterprise architecture here too. And this is really, they're missing it. I think your job is increase reach and brand awareness, but just look up.
That's right. That's right. And it's starting to happen. What's interesting for us is we partnered with several hyperscalers to make sure they had the option, if you will, had it in their toolkit. We've even joined their marketplaces. So if you look up in the marketplace for network solutions, we will show up. So we're trying to make sure we're in these channels and in these areas where the designers and architects can find our tools.
Yeah, yeah. So what role can satellite play beyond delivering communications and network backup?
Well, I mean, I don't want to go beyond. I mean, that's a great thing we start with, to your point. But really, a lot of times what we look at now is you have. I'm going to tell you a little story, John, just to kind of set the stage. Yeah. A hyperscaler brought me into a meeting with a large train operator in Western United States, and when I walked in, they said, "Here's a satellite person," and I said, "That's great to meet you." And the person said, well, great. Tell me about your Earth observation capability, your IoT direct-to-device, and your SATCOM. And I said, well, gee, in our industry, that's fragmented between 3 different categories, and there's probably 5 or 6 players in each one of them. And they don't talk to each other. So your point about what can it do, I think interoperability between these systems is where we're headed. You're starting to see SATCOM systems that could maybe deliver imagery from another system via space data relay. We recently did a NASA program where we're in that process of doing that. So you're starting to see integration of these different formats and delivering content much more real time. So it's around situational awareness. But again, you're sort of tailoring it for that outcome, driving it towards the outcome.
I reflect on my conversations with enterprise architects again, and they use the word you just used, interoperability. Yeah. And they kind of they don't look, the east and west, but not up and down.
That's right.
And so this whole concept of interop, you can put in a whiteboard and talk about it and draw things, but what has to happen to satellite to play this expanded role?
So first of all, I mentioned making sure we were in their toolkits. Make awareness is our first thing, to your point. The second thing about it is the standards. There's 3GPPs, or the non-terrestrial networking standards. These things are really helping make sure that we can integrate. And then ease of adoption. One of the key things that people think about satellite, it's too complicated. We've got to make it easier for people to implement it and adopt it and consume it. And that also means making sure the system's flexible. Oftentimes in the past, you deploy a satellite network and you say, great, I deployed it, I'm done. Well, if you look at terrestrial networks, they're oftentimes studying the use of this network, optimizing it, and evolving it quickly. We have to do the same thing. We can't just sort of deploy and forget. We need to really work with the enterprise and the partners that are managing it to make sure they're optimizing their use. So I hope that's all part of that chain.
It's almost like a continuous endeavor, isn't it? It's not set it and forget it. It's set it and I'll be back in 5 minutes. It's always constantly optimizing because it's changing. It's so dynamic.
That's right. You're watching the applications, then they get ideas. Well, what if I try to do this? Like, great, let's take a look at it. And so you keep evolving it for sure.
If you talk to the people at Akamai, they talk about a terrestrial network. Everyone knows them, and they know about terrestrial networks out there. A bunch of different networks out there. So what do satellite networks need to integrate with terrestrial networks to deliver infrastructure resilience?
So I guess we kind of touched on a little bit, but if you think about the end-to-end architecture of satellite communications, you're going to have the equipment side of it in terms of at the premise. So you're going to want to make sure it fits, it's a form factor, and the performance of it is what they need. Sometimes you'll have people say, hey, look, I don't really need a highly resilient. I just need best efforts. Great, there's those options. Then they say, look, these applications I'm running are super important. I want a service level agreement. I need that high quality service. So you sort of bring that service. And then sometimes you have a mix of those two, and you actually have an SD-WAN. You set it up to manage the traffic across it. So at the premise or at the customer site, you have a piece that needs to be really designed, and it's got to be able to be evolved, to your point about where the applications are going over time. Then you go through the different systems, and then you have the aggregation of the gateway side of it and how it interfaces. One of the things we did early on is a lot of customers that have really high value applications want them to go directly into their cloud environment and avoid going through the internet. They were previously doing VPNs, and we can now offer a direct private network that gives them comfort that they'll never have any of the variability of the internet might occur. Give you an example. We worked with Microsoft with their Azure Express Route. AWS has the Direct Connect. I can kind of go through all the alphabet soup there. We worked with Oracle and their Fast Connect. So just all of them have this type of private networking, and we wanted to make sure it was available at our gateways so that our customers who want those applications secure end to end, we could deliver it.
Well, you mentioned Oracle and AWS and Microsoft, these big what they call hyperscalers. So we know there's a growing number of applications and services are moving to the cloud. We know that. And so what about them? What roles are the hyperscalers like AWS and Microsoft playing to ensure this infrastructure resilience? Not all on you there, Sergy, is it?
That's right. That's right. No, that was really our goal is, their world is the idea of sell to, sell with, sell through. And they have a lot of tools, but they're very programmatic. Everything has to be at scale. So you got to fit in their architecture. So the idea of putting a set product in their marketplace, it's got to be click and go, right? They don't want a lot of high touch experience. In addition to that, a lot of ways that they work is they do first a proof of concept. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. And once that's proven successful, then they run to scale. They try to simplify it, build a bill of material, put it in their systems, and then they can run with it in terms of implementing it. And they put it out in their catalog. And that's how you get it out there. So let me give you some examples of that. So we worked with Microsoft as an example in Taiwan. They worked with first responders trying to do a deployable private 5G setup if their terrestrial network is down due to a natural event. And we did it. The government was very pleased with it because they were able to use the same applications, laptops, pads, and phones. All were on the same application, and all getting the data back to the headquarters so they can make decisions quickly about the first response activity. So that kind of end-to-end deployable infrastructure, something satellite communications can do, especially when there's an event. But of course, it wasn't that they called us up at the last minute and say, hey, we just had an event, can you show up? It was all pre-planned, designed, so that when they had an event, they were ready to execute.
Serge, I remember a few years back, I started studying 5G, and remember you'd see the little diagrams, and you say, and the satellite was always in those diagrams, and I don't know if it was intentional, they just forgot about it or not, but let's talk a little bit about 5G here, So what role will 5G play in infrastructure resilience? So, and how does satellite fit into that ecosystem? The old map from 6 years ago?
Yeah, exactly right. And just it's interesting you look that far back, John, because we invested to have people in that standards process to make sure non-terrestrial networks were included in the design of 5G. So it's been in that roadmap, to your point about the icon. But in terms of applications or scenarios, one of the things we've seen is if you look at the sort of the public or the macro 5G deployments, we've been working with MNOs and showing how SATCOM can either extend the service, give route diversity, just in case they only have like one fiber at their POP and they want to make sure they had route diversity, or even a disaster recovery or a scheduled event, maybe a big rock concert, for example. How they can use our services to sort of implement and deploy the 5G so people have the same experience whether they're in the center of the city or out in a remote area. So that was sort of the first one. And the second is the private 5G area, the enterprise implementation of it. And to your point, that does two things. One, it's used as a primary thing, but it also can be used with other technologies as part of a resilient fabric. They may have other wireless technologies, but they want to have a combination to make sure they have high uptime. We've done private 5G deployments. We've worked with offshore energy players who deploy multiple networks on site to make sure that let's say the remote platform is highly automated, improved performance and yield on the system, but they need more than one network to connect it. They sometimes even have fiber to them in the Gulf, but they want several satellite networks on top of it to give them that high uptime because they're trying to get to the cloud and they can rely on the cloud.
I'm thinking about a group experience like a concert, and it used to be nice to have Wi-Fi connections, and now it's almost mandatory because I think if you're under 35. Everything's done on the phone. I had an electrician come out. I scheduled it on the phone. He gave me an estimate on the phone, and I paid him on the phone. But it's all phone. And so if you want to have a good user experience at a football game, a Super Bowl, or at a concert, you really have to think about that backup and resilience. I mean, this is not thinking about the military at all, but just in a commercial environment. You have to have backup to that user experience is becoming so important today. Opening up the box from Apple, the user experience, huh?
Right. We had another example like that. We did work with Microsoft also on a sporting event in Qatar. I can't name the brand, but we did provide resiliency for that architecture because they wanted to make sure certain applications were mirrored. There you go. Were mirrored between two different regions, and the performance was great. Because the regions were so far apart, if you will, on our system, they didn't know the latency over satellite. Because oftentimes you hear about latency, but the MEO system. It was like 200 milliseconds difference between fiber and MEO because of the distance of the two regions, but it worked out great. They got a high performance out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I keep thinking of user experience and retail and everything else, but user experiences for big events too, and huge. I mean, the people, for example, in a soccer game, and people all over the world are watching. It's incredible. So we've talked about some use cases. So do you have any other satellite-enabled use cases you see really moving the needle for infrastructure resilience? Anything else?
So, as I think I mentioned some of the segments we serve. Government is a very big area. They have forward deployed people. They want to make sure they have multiple networks providing high quality, high uptime services for their application. But on the commercial side as well, we're seeing it. And our team that works with the cruise industry, for example, they deploy an integrated suite of satellite communications. And then as the ship gets closer to the shore, suddenly it switches to microwave and switches to fiber when it's active. So seeing these sort of commercial applications, but it's really around, what are the key infrastructure and applications they want to maintain. And that's, they're able to sort of take those networks and say, this traffic is, guest traffic, this is the operation of the vessel, this traffic's for the crew. And they're able to manage it across different networks and maintain a good experience.
Well, this has been a fun interview. I think you've given our listeners a real handle on the whole concept of infrastructure resilience and new flexible ways to think about that. Sure.
Can I throw one more in because it's one of my passion projects? So you talk about using SATCOM as resiliency for terrestrial services, right? Yeah. I want to talk about SATCOM also providing resiliency for space operations. Right. So we want to contract with the NASA to do a space data relay. So give you an example, we partner with Planet Labs, who does Earth observation imagery, and we're able to connect their LEOs to our MEO and GEO systems to help them provide services faster, backhaul the content faster, and increase resiliency. Because I started the world with GEO satellites that always had a TT&C link, and now we're finding. I learned that the LEO systems, they didn't always have a persistent link. And now with using our GEO system, they can provide LEO systems a persistent link to both task them faster, to change orientation if they need to, or deal with any type of operational issue. So the idea of space resiliency is also coming into this. So just as a little plug.
No, it's just like the enterprise architect not looking up. Maybe when you're up, you should look across, because it's also another way to get back up, isn't it?
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
Well, you've sure given our listeners a lot to think about here as far as backup goes. This has been a real fun interview. I'd like to thank our guest, Sergy Mummert. He's a Senior Vice President for Sales Global Cloud and Strategic Partnerships at SES.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.